As Jesse said, I'm Kendall Kilberger. I'm really excited to share this message that I have today, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions to follow. So thank you so much for being here. Not all injuries are visible. This is a saying that I've become very accustomed to over the last 4.5 months after I was hit by a car when I was walking in the street on August 12th and suffered from a variety of brain injuries. This can be a good thing, hiding this vulnerability. People don't always get to see what's going on inside, the pain that I feel. But at the same time, it can also be invalidating. Not everyone can see, and maybe they just don't understand. So today I wish to remove that apparent cloak of invisibility and try to understand what exactly happened to me that day and since that day, and hopefully get to share that with all of you. So let's kind of start with what actually happened, and there's a lot of terms that I simply still do not understand, so let's just try and parse those out. So this is the MRI language that was given to me right after my accident. And so I'm gonna highlight a few items, and we're gonna really set the stage for that. So first, I'll paraphrase here, we see parenchymal and subarachnoid hemorrhaging. The second topic I'd like to discuss is edema, and then the third is subdural hemorrhaging. So I'm gonna let that marinate. To this day, even after doing this whole presentation, I just don't even know where to begin with that. I'm a lawyer, I'm not in the medical field. I did take one neuropsychology class in college, but I am not an expert on any of this. And so I really want to sit down and understand what these terms mean. So when I was first introduced to these ideas when I was in the hospital, my therapist explained the idea of the difference between hardware and software. So there's hardware issues in the brain and there's software issues in the brain. And so that's kind of the stage or the roadmap that I'd like to discuss today. So first we'll start with the hardware issues. So let's talk about the brain. We'll do a brain map. Let's understand the different types of injuries I suffered. What's a hemorrhage? What is edema? And then we'll talk more about the software issues later. So we'll go over what is a mild traumatic brain injury or a TBI? What is the vestibular system and what kind of happened there in my instance? And then we'll explain what post-traumatic stress disorder is, or PTSD, and how that's impacted me over these past 4.5 months. So we'll start with the brain map. So your brain has two different hemispheres, so left hemisphere and right hemisphere. And in both hemispheres, you have 4 different lobes, and you'll see those on the image here. So we have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. So instead of going over all of these, I'm going to centralize my discussion on the temporal lobe because that's where most of my injuries occurred. So what does the temporal lobe do? What does it control? So the temporal lobe focuses on a variety of things. It works on short-term memory, speech, musical rhythm, and smell recognition. A lot of these have changed in the time since my brain injury. Good thing I never had musical rhythm, so that didn't really matter. But what exactly though happened here? So if you can recall from the language that I discussed, I pointed out parenchymal and subarachnoid hemorrhage, and I also discussed subdural hemorrhaging. So I want to focus the discussion now on those different types of hemorrhaging and what that means. So on the next slide, we'll see these different types of hemorrhaging. So the first one we'll discuss is the parenchymal or intracerebral hemorrhaging. Before I begin, I wanted to emphasize that a hemorrhage is different than the word hematoma that you see here. Hemorrhaging means that you have a brain bleed that is spread out, it's moving. But a hematoma is like a bruise in your brain, the bleeding is localized. So in my case, I had a hemorrhage, so that's what I'd like to focus on here. So the intracerebral or parenchymal hemorrhaging, that is a bleed that occurs within the functional tissues of the brain. So you can see that is where this image is right here. Second is the subarachnoid hemorrhaging. The subarachnoid hemorrhage is bleeding that occurs in the space surrounding the brain, but specifically in this under the subarachnoid space right here. And then finally, the subdural hemorrhaging, not hematoma, hemorrhaging. And that is the bleeding that occurs in the area between the brain and the skull. So all of these, we're talking about hemorrhaging, we're talking about brain bleeding, but just in different parts of the brain and how that affects different aspects of your life following that. So let's return back to the MRI language. We just went over parenchymal subarachnoid, and we also talked about subdural hemorrhaging. But the last thing we didn't talk about was edema, and quickly, that's just another term for swelling in the brain. So I'm going to highlight in red for you a lot of these other terms. So you'll see some of the language like lateral, posterior, inferior. Those are directional terms. And instead of going over all the directional terms within the brain and within your body, I've done the hard work for you, and I've located what all of this means. And essentially, this is the area in my brain where all of those hemorrhages and the edema was occurring. So on the right side of my brain, it's almost like I'm looking this way, temporal lobe, and in this area. So that was a lot, but that was the hardware issues. So let's return back to the roadmap that I discussed earlier. As you see, we've done brain map, we've done hemorrhaging, we've done edema. So let's check that off. Now we're going to talk about the software issues. We're going to talk about mild TBIs, the vestibular system, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So let's begin with a mild TBI. So a mild TBI, the word mild is very misleading because mild doesn't mean that your symptoms are mild. It means that instead of being unconscious for more than 30 minutes, you were unconscious for less than 30 minutes, and that's what occurred in my situation. So that's what mild TBI means, but like I said, symptoms are not so mild. And so here we can see a variety of the symptoms that a lot of people experience when they have a mild TBI. So for instance, sleep difficulties, poor concentration, irritability, fatigue, depression, memory problems. Those are just some of the most prevalent symptoms that you can see in what we call post-concussion syndrome. So a mild TBI is a synonym or the same word as concussion. There's another way to say that. And when you suffer from these types of symptoms, that's what is called post-concussion syndrome. So as you can see, it's not so mild. There's a lot of things that people suffer from, and this is not an exhaustive list. This is just a lot of the things that people typically see and deal with when they experience a mild TBI. So the first part of the software issues that I would like to discuss. Let's move on to the vestibular system. So what is that? So let's start off with that discussion. So the vestibular system is located within your ears. It's a sensory system that deals with four different functions. First, it deals with motion. It provides your brain with information with respect to motion. Am I moving? Am I stopped? The second is head position. Am I turning left? Am I up and down? Where is my head in space? The third is spatial orientation. That means where am I in the world? Am I going up in an elevator? Am I on the flat surface? Things like that. And then last, we see balance. So this is really the four main topics or four main functions the vestibular system provides information to your brain about. But like I said, let's really focus on where that is. So I'd like to point your attention to the inner ear. So this is where the vestibular system really takes hold, and we'll focus primarily on the semicircular canals in the inner ear. So within the semicircular canals that we see here, there are two structures that are important to note. And these are the utricle and the saccule. So within the utricle and saccule, you have these little hair structures. And on the hair structures, you have calcium carbonate crystals. So just crystals for layman's terms, I guess, and it's easier to say. But yeah, so you have crystals on these hair follicles, and there are issues when these crystals fall off the hair follicles. And these crystals can fall off into the fluid within the semicircular canals. And that is what we call BPPV. So let's look at a picture of this. So you see here, it's quite small, but I'll point it out, the utricle and the saccule, and you see here are the normal crystals that are typically in your ear. Those are on the hairs. But now we see in this picture, these are all the crystals that are displaced. They're floating around within the fluid within your semicircular canals. And what happens to you? How do you know if you have BPPV? Well, in my instance, every time I would turn my head, every time I'd change from sitting to standing or laying down, it felt like the world was spinning, or vertigo, another way to call that. I often like to explain to people as it was almost as if there was a snow globe being shaken in my head. And that is very invasive in your daily life. And thankfully with the therapy that I've received here and throughout my entire time at Shirley Ryan Inpatient as well, that's been able to subside. However, it has been a long journey, but I'm very, very lucky to have worked through this. And the interesting thing is that not everyone with a brain injury deals with this. That doesn't mean just because you have a brain injury you get BPPV. But on the other token, you can get BPPV without having a brain injury. So you can get BPPV if you have a disease within your inner ears. So this can happen to a variety of different patients with different defects or problems, but in my particular instance, it happened because of the brain injury. That concludes our discussion on the vestibular system and BPPV. So let's finalize our software issues by talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental disorder that occurs after a traumatic event has occurred. And there are 4 types of symptoms that occur when you're experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. So there are 4 types, like I said: intrusive memories, avoidance, negative thinking and mood, and changes in physical and emotional reactions. So I'd like to really focus on each of those individually. So we'll start with intrusive memories. So this occurs when you have nightmares about the traumatic incident, or you're living your daily life and the incident is recurring in your head. And that certainly has happened to me throughout this time. And it's something that with a lot of therapy, again, you can work through all of these symptoms you can. The second is avoidance. Avoiding talking about the traumatic injury or experience. Avoiding the place or people that remind you of the traumatic injury or experience. And then the third is negative thinking and mood. And this really can be associated with depressive symptoms, such as feeling helpless or hopeless, or just being generally irritable about the situation or about the traumatic event. All of which, again, it's, just exactly as I experienced it, just feeling that sense of, will I ever get better? Will this ever, go away? And then finally, we see changes in physical and emotional reactions. And this is really focused on being very scared, or you're always on your fight or flight. For instance, if someone, taps you on the shoulder, jumping within your skin, or knocking on the door, or things like that, easily scared or frightened, always on alert. I remember in the hospital, the nurse would knock on the door, I'd jump up, and there was no danger, but my body was just in that sense of fight or flight at all times. Now, what's interesting is that not everyone that suffers from a brain injury has PTSD. And that's because if you have a brain injury like mine, sometimes the brain just doesn't form the memories of the incident at all. So you don't remember the entire day, you don't remember the incident. But in my situation, I remember a lot. I remember the entire day. I remember everything leading up until the headlights of the car. And so that's why a lot of these things just, I get reminded all the time, because my brain can retrieve those memories, while other people, it doesn't. But I also like to point out the idea that sometimes your body keeps score. Your body can remember the trauma, even if your brain can't retrieve a memory. Maybe you hear something, your body just remembers it, or you feel a certain way, or you get nudged a certain way. Your body can keep that score too. So this can happen to a lot of people, even if you don't remember everything, and that certainly happened to me as well. So returning back to our roadmap, to centralize our discussion, we talked about hardware Now we've talked about all the software issues, mild TBI, vestibular system, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So let's check that off. But if you thought we were done, we are not, because like I said, I am a lawyer, so you can't escape the law in this conversation. But do not worry, I will not bore you. Let's just quickly talk about something that's been really interesting to me throughout this time. So when you're in an accident like mine, or someone's in an accident like mine, there are two types of penalties that the perpetrator or the person that hit you with the car, or was the one that was involved in the accident, can incur. So there are criminal penalties and there are civil penalties. So I think most people are aware of, or at least know what criminal penalties are, but if not, just to go over that, that's when someone you hear on television breaking the law, you're breaking the criminal code, you know, you're getting like pressed with criminal charges. So that's one way that the person who, in my instance, hit me with the car, or in other instances, can face charges. But what I'd like to really focus on is the civil penalties discussion, because I don't think that's as well known and something that's been really interesting to me to learn over time. So in law school, we learn civil penalties through tort law. So what is tort law? That just means someone's wronged you and you want to get compensated for it. And when you're trying to be compensated for a wrong, typically what the legal standard is, you want to make the victim whole. So what does that mean? If you're in a car accident, you lose your leg, you want to make them whole again. Well, how do you make them whole? You can't return their leg. You give them money. And money can occur through medical bills, lost wages, lots of different types of things. And when I was a law student and now an attorney, I understand that from a legal aspect. That makes sense to me. However, I think my perspective has changed as the victim in this situation, because I often look at all the things I've been through. You know, what is the value of not having recurring nightmares about an incident? What is the value of not having vertigo every time I sleep? Like, what is the value of that? And whatever lump sum of money, it could be $5, it could be $10, it could be $1 million, does that actually make me whole? Does it ever return me back to the old Kendall? The Kendall that was there on August 11th, the day before the incident, the Kendall that was there when it happened. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is not to return back to the old Kendall. For such a long time, I've always been comparing myself. Who was I before? Where am I at now? Am I me again? Am I me again, searching for that me again? But that's not who I am anymore. I'm different. A lot of things have happened. A lot of things have changed. I've been through a lot. And I don't think that I should be searching for who I was prior to the accident. And if you can recall, I started the discussion today with not all injuries are visible. And I think that is absolutely true. You can't see what's happening in my brain when I stand here in front of you. A lot of people don't really know. But there is something that is visible that has come out of all of this. And that's me. That's the new me that stands here today. The new me that's strong. She's proud, she's confident, and she's ready. She's ready to turn the page and begin the next chapter of her life. Thank you.